This has happened before. Not a vague historical rhyme, not a loose parallel, an actual previous episode in a real society with the same core problem, the same public anxiety, and the same commentary about what was wrong with young men. And that society did something about it, something enormous, something almost completely forgotten. I am going to call what happened the Victorian pivot. That is my name for it, not a term historians use. There is no famous turning point, no chapter heading in any textbook. What exists unmistakably in the record is a pattern, a decades-long wave of a specific kind of response to a specific kind of problem. Giving it a name makes it easier to see. But you should know the name is mine and the pattern is real. I would rather tell you that up front than let you repeat something in an argument and get caught out. Victorian Britain, roughly the middle of the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution is pulling young men out of villages by the hundreds of thousands and depositing them into cities, London, Manchester, Glasgow, Birmingham, to work. And when they arrive, something has been stripped out of their lives that nobody planned for and nobody at first noticed. In the village, a young man was embedded. He had family within walking distance, a church attended since birth, a trade entered under someone who knew him, neighbors who had watched him grow up, and 100 small obligations holding him in place. He arrived in the city with none of it. He had a job, a rented room, and no one. The results were exactly what you would expect, and exactly what the Victorians spent decades writing anxious pamphlets about. Young men adrift, drinking heavily, gambling, marrying later or not at all, disconnected from institutions, from communities, from anything giving a life shape, leaving enormous numbers for the colonies and America, which drained so many young men out of Britain that it fed a whole national debate about the resulting imbalance between the sexes. In 1862, William Rathbone Gregg published a widely discussed piece asking why so many women were, in the language of the time, redundant, unable to find husbands. His answer pointed substantially at the young men who had gone abroad. An entire national conversation about a shortage of available men, driven by young men exiting the system in enormous numbers. That is a Victorian debate, and it is also uncomfortably a modern one. Here is what they did about it, and here is the entire reason this video exists. They built things, not campaigns, not commentary, not sermons about what was wrong with the younger generation. Well, those too, obviously, they were Victorians. But alongside the moralizing, they undertook one of the most extraordinary waves of institution building in modern history. And a huge proportion of it was aimed squarely at unattached young men. Physical buildings, membership organizations, clubs, brigades, associations, teams, unions, societies. Places a man could walk into on a Tuesday evening and be a member of something. That is the thing we forgot. That is the pivot. Because look at our response to the same underlying situation. We have commentary, panels, think pieces, documentaries, and public conversations about the crisis of young men. Start with the clearest case, because it was aimed at precisely the man being described. In 1844 in London, a 22-year-old draper's assistant named George Williams founded the Young Men's Christian Association. Williams was himself exactly the type, a young man who had come from the countryside to the city for work and found himself among other young men living in poor lodgings with nothing to do and nowhere to belong. He started with a prayer meeting among his fellow drapers' assistants. Within decades, it had become a global movement with buildings in cities across the world, reading rooms, gymnasiums, lodgings, libraries, classes, and above all, a place where a young man alone in a large city could go and be among people who expected him. In 1862, a Unitarian minister named Henry Solly founded the Working Men's Club and Institute Union. The idea was disarmingly simple. Working men needed somewhere to go in the evening that was not the pub. So build them clubs, actual premises with reading rooms, newspapers, lectures, games, and company, and federate them into a national organization. Not an exhortation to drink less, a physical alternative to the place where the drinking happened, run by and for the men who used it. In 1859, amid an invasion scare, Britain raised the volunteer force, a part-time rifle volunteer movement that swept the country and absorbed enormous numbers of young men into local units with drills, uniforms, ranks, competitions, and camaraderie. It gave shape to the empty evenings that everyone was so worried about. Then there is the movement that gave the whole era its flavor, muscular Christianity, associated with writers like Charles Kingsley and Thomas Hughes, whose novel Tom Brown's School Days appeared in 1857 and became one of the most influential books of the century. Its practical consequence was the codification of organized games as a central institution. The Football Association formed in 1863. County cricket organized itself. Athletics clubs multiplied. A very large part of the organized sport we now take for granted was constructed in a few Victorian decades, and a substantial motivation was giving young men teams to belong to. Then the friendly societies, mutual aid organizations in which working men paid regular subscriptions and drew sickness and funeral benefits in return, but with lodges, meetings, rituals, and offices a man could rise to hold. Membership reached into the millions. In 1883, in Glasgow, William Alexander Smith founded the Boys' Brigade. Drill, uniforms, ranks, band, discipline, and companionship for boys and young men in a rapidly industrialized city. It spread fast and established a template that ran directly into the 20th century when Robert Baden-Powell published Scouting for Boys in 1908, and the Scout movement exploded worldwide. Around all of this sat a dense supporting layer, the Mechanics' Institutes offering technical education and libraries, the temperance organizations building halls and societies to compete with the pub rather than merely condemning it. The Salvation Army founded in 1865 combining uniforms, ranks, and bands with practical relief. Public libraries opening in city after city. Choral societies. Brass bands, debating clubs, cycling clubs, and 1,000 local organizations too small to name individually. Step back and look at the shape of what has just been described. Over a few decades, a society facing a mass of unanchored young men responded by constructing an entire parallel architecture of belonging. Buildings to enter, memberships to hold, ranks to rise through, teams to play for, uniforms to wear, meetings to attend, obligations to fulfill, and other men who would notice your absence. Whatever else you say about the Victorians, and there is plenty to say, they answered the problem of the disconnected young man by building him somewhere to go, physically, in brick, by the thousands. So why did this approach have traction on the specific problem it was aimed at? Because it is not enough to admire the scale of the building. The interesting question is what the building supplied, and whether the ingredients are identifiable. I think there are 4 of them. The first is a physical place. A disconnected young man does not primarily need to be told something. He needs somewhere to go. The distance between having nowhere to be on a Tuesday evening and having somewhere to be on a Tuesday evening is the entire distance between disconnection and connection. and it cannot be crossed by a message however well crafted. The second is membership, the state of formally belonging to a defined thing. Membership is a specific psychological good, and it is not the same as attendance. It means there is a group with a name, and you are inside it, and the group knows you are inside it. That is precisely what the village had supplied automatically, and what the city had stripped away, and the Victorians rebuilt it deliberately in artificial form. The third ingredient is structure with progression. Ranks, offices, grades, teams, badges, promotions. Look at how obsessively the Victorian institutions provided this. The friendly society had officers you could rise to become. The volunteer corps had ranks. The brigade had ranks and drill. The sports club had teams and selections. Scouting turned progression into an entire architecture of badges and became the most successful youth movement in history, partly on the strength of it. Progression converts undifferentiated time into a path. The fourth ingredient is the body. Almost everything on the Victorian list involves physical activity, drill, sport, gymnasium, marching, band. The Victorians were not sophisticated about the physiology, but they had noticed something real. Hard physical activity in company with other men produces both a settled mind and a bond between the participants that conversation alone does not produce. Shared exertion binds people. Underneath the four ingredients sits a fifth thing, which is the diagnosis itself. The Victorian institution builders, the good ones at least, operated on the assumption that the disconnected young man was a normal man in an abnormal situation. Not a defective specimen, not a moral failure requiring correction. A person who had been removed from the structures that people need, who would function perfectly well if the structures were rebuilt around him. That is why they built rather than only lectured. Because if you think the problem is missing infrastructure, building infrastructure is the obvious response. Your diagnosis determines your instrument. Theirs pointed at construction. An honest caveat here, because I promised accuracy. I cannot tell you these institutions solved the problem, and any historian would rightly object if I tried. What I can tell you with confidence is what they built, at what scale, aimed at whom, and that millions of men joined. Now the part that should genuinely bother you, because we face a structurally similar situation, and we have responded in a completely different register. And the difference is the whole lesson. Our response has been overwhelmingly rhetorical. We have produced an extraordinary volume of talk about disconnected young men, commentary, analysis, documentaries, podcasts, panels, reports, campaigns, and an entire cottage industry of people explaining what is happening to men. Some of it is excellent. Some of it is this channel. And I am not exempting myself from anything I am about to say. But look at what almost none of it is. None of it is a building. None of it is a membership. None of it is a place a 24-year-old man with nowhere to be on a Tuesday evening can physically walk into and belong to. Meanwhile, the infrastructure that did exist has been quietly hollowing out for decades. Voluntary association membership across the developed world has been in long-documented decline. The clubs, lodges, brigades, unions, leagues, and societies that used to fill towns have shrunk, merged, aged, or closed. Places of worship, which supplied an enormous amount of this function, have emptied. Institutional membership of nearly every kind has fallen. The pattern is not disputed, and it is not new. It has been tracked and written about for a generation. We inherited a dense architecture of belonging built substantially in the Victorian period, and we have spent decades letting it decay without replacing it with anything of comparable physical solidity. They reached for bricks. We reached for discourse. And discourse is not a substitute for somewhere to be. A man cannot join a conversation the way he can join a club. The deeper thing we forgot is not the building. It is the diagnosis that produced the building. The Victorians largely understood that a young man alone in a city with no institutions was facing a structural problem, a missing infrastructure problem, and that the appropriate response was to supply the missing infrastructure. We have substantially reframed the same condition as a personal problem, a character problem, a motivation problem, something wrong inside the man rather than something missing around him. You can hear it in the vocabulary, which is the tell. The disconnected young man today is described as lazy, entitled, unmotivated, a failure to launch, a man who needs to try harder, get off the couch, apply himself, take responsibility. Every one of those is a diagnosis located inside the man. And once your diagnosis is located inside the man, your instrument becomes exhortation. Stated as precisely as I can state it, not a technique, but a direction of attention. The Victorians looked at the disconnected young man and asked what was missing around him. We look at the same man and ask what is wrong inside him. Both questions produce action, but they produce completely different action. One produces buildings, the other produces lectures, and only one of them puts a door in front of a man who has nowhere to go on a Tuesday evening. We did not merely stop building, we stopped seeing the problem as the kind of problem that building solves. Several things have to be held carefully here, because history is very easy to weaponize into nostalgia, and I am not interested in doing that. The Victorians were not admirable across the board, and this is not a case for restoring their world. Much of what has been described was profoundly paternalistic. Middle-class reformers building institutions for working-class young men with a heavy component of moral supervision, class condescension, and social control mixed into the benevolence. Many of these organizations were explicitly religious in ways that excluded people, or sectarian, or hostile to those outside the fold. The era's attitudes toward women, toward the colonized, and toward the poor ranged from limiting to appalling. I am pointing at one specific practice, the building of joinable institutions for unanchored young men, and I am not endorsing the society that produced it. You can take a technique from people without taking their worldview. The motives were also mixed. The volunteer force existed because Britain was frightened of invasion. Scouting carried an explicit national preparedness motivation following alarming reports about army recruits after the Boer War. Do not overmap the parallel either. Victorian conditions were not our conditions. Their disconnection was produced by physical migration into cities. Ours is produced by a tangle of technological, economic, and cultural changes that have no exact 19th century equivalent. Their young men had no telephones and no internet. Ours are constantly connected and still somehow unanchored, which is a genuinely different puzzle. Their institutions worked on a population with different expectations, different leisure, different working hours, and different assumptions about authority. The parallel is real, and it is instructive, but a solution transplanted whole from 1870 into 2026 would not survive the journey. The transferable thing is the diagnosis and the ingredients, not the specific organizations. And none of this means individual effort does not matter. Understanding that the infrastructure is missing is not saying a man is helpless without it. Let me speak directly to you now, the men who are disconnected, disengaged, and hearing constantly that this is a defect in your character. A previous society looked at men in your exact position and reached the opposite conclusion. They saw young men severed from community, adrift in cities with no institutions and nowhere to be, and they did not conclude those men were lazy or entitled or morally deficient. They concluded the structures had been stripped out from around them, and that the appropriate response was to build the structures back. That was the mainstream Victorian view held by the people who did the most about it. And it is worth sitting with, because it means the interpretation currently being applied to you is not the only one available. It is a choice. A different society facing the same facts chose differently, and they were not being soft. The Victorians were about as hard-nosed a society as the modern world has produced. They were perfectly capable of moralizing at people, and frequently did. And yet, on this specific question, their practical judgment was that a man alone with no institutions is facing a missing infrastructure problem, and that you fix it by building infrastructure. If a society that unsentimental looked at this and reached for construction rather than only condemnation, that tells you something about which diagnosis actually fits the facts. So here is what that means for the accusation you keep hearing. When you are told you are failing to launch, the thing being left out of that sentence is that you are being asked to launch from a platform that has been quietly dismantled. The clubs, the lodge, the brigade, the institute, the league, the dense architecture of joinable belonging has thinned out drastically, and nobody replaced it. But here is the hard half, and I am not going to leave it out, because the accurate diagnosis is only useful if it leads somewhere. Understanding that the infrastructure is missing does not summon it. Nobody is going to build you a club. There is no Victorian philanthropist coming to your city with a subscription list. Which means the practical implication of everything in this video is not that you should feel better about having nowhere to go. It is that you now know precisely what you are missing and what to go and find and what it needs to contain. That is worth far more than comfort. It is a specification, and the specification is right there in the 4 ingredients. Use them as a checklist. A physical place you actually go to, not a feed, not a server. A location with a door. A membership where a defined group knows you are in it and notices when you are not. A structure with progression where you can rise, improve, take on an office, make a team, earn something within a system that recognizes it. And something physical done hard alongside other people, because shared exertion builds bonds that conversation does not. A gym with actual training partners, a martial arts club with grades, a team sport with a squad and a season, a trade association, a volunteer service, a choir, a climbing club, a rescue crew. The label matters far less than whether it contains the 4 ingredients. Find one that does, join it properly, and keep turning up. That is the Victorian answer, stripped of its era and handed to you as a set of instructions. Take the reframe and then take the assignment. You are not defective for finding this hard. The thing that used to make it easy was dismantled, and you were handed the bill for its absence. That is the true account, and you should hold on to it. And then go and rebuild your own small piece of it deliberately for yourself, because the men who did the building in 1860 were not waiting for anyone either. They were young men in exactly your position who decided to construct what was missing. George Williams was a 22-year-old shop assistant living in bad lodgings when he started what became the Young Men's Christian Association. He did not have a plan for a global movement. He had a room, some friends in the same situation, and a regular meeting. That is where all of it started. A door, a membership, a ladder, and something hard in company. That was the whole Victorian answer, and it is still available.